Good morning, beautiful people of the internet, and welcome once more to our Sunday special live. Joined as always by the lovely Helen, Chorley, the enigmatic Piotr, and the mind-blowing Adam Lawrence. Don't forget myself, Jay Howard. And we are here this Sunday to talk absolute rubbish. That's a lie. We never do that. We're always on point. We always stick to the topic. We're always going in the right direction. We're always packing value. Don't worry. We're going to start off with proponomics. That's Adam's moniker. That's how we know that we're in the right direction. And we fannied about a little bit with Michael Barry this morning on the supplement. I love that little segue into the world of crazy financial individuals. You still didn't put the picture of Margot Robbie in the you didn't use that as your marketing ploy. That was an opportunity missed, because every time I think of that film, that's all I see.
I can understand that. I don't want to be accused of clickbait. You know, hopefully the supplements readers elevate and listeners elevate themselves to a level beyond just looking at Margot Robbie's legs or whatever. But and of course, there's at least as many female listeners and readers as there are male, Jay. Of course. So let's have that straight first of all.
Of course. But let's remember that women are allowed to admire other women's legs without it being sexual. Okay. So let's not take it to a dark place. Let's just say she's a stunningly attractive woman, and looking at her legs is open and available to everyone on the planet. So there you go.
Certainly, let's not take it to a dark place within the first minute and a half. Anyway, that's a fair point, my friend. We usually do that about quarter of an hour to half an hour in, don't we? Realistically, but yes, I felt Dr. Michael Burry deserved a mention this week because I alluded very briefly to it when the filing came out. Which is the middle of August. So for those who don't know, if you are trading in America, it's a fund of over $100 million. You need to basically tell the Securities and Exchange Commission about all of your significant trades in the previous quarter, and you have around about 6 weeks after the end of the quarter to make that filing. And the point is, it offers that element of transparency as to what's going on. But of course, 6 weeks after something has happened, or more than 6 weeks, because it's everything that's happened in the previous quarter, is not meaningfully damaging to the people in the fund, nor is it too meaningful for anybody to sort of piggyback and all the rest of it. But it is interesting. And I gave a shout out today to the Buffett tracker, which is a Twitter account that, although the way he spelt it, it looks like the buffet tracker. So I don't know if you just sort of supposed to travel around Las Vegas or somewhere going to the best buffets, which would be a great Twitter account. Don't get me wrong, really useful. But the Buffett tracker talks about what Berkshire Hathaway have done, because famously they don't invest in a lot of companies. You know, they very much believe in what they call focus investing, not buying the whole of the market, but buying some specific companies. And of course, you also have to file when you've bought over 5% of a company, which is another reason why Berkshire often come up in the news, because they don't mess around. And when they go for something, they're looking to take a really significant shareholding, if not even consider taking it private, or certainly having a couple of Berkshire representatives on the board. So anyway, Dr. Burry, and it was classic. This lives somewhere between total misunderstanding and deliberate manipulation / misinformation of people. The headlines were all, he's put a $1.6 billion bet on the stock market falling. Now, obviously, people's net worths are always shrouded in mystery, and that the size of his fund is not even to the tune of $1.6 billion, because he doesn't like dealing with difficult investors, as he did in the great movie The Big Short. And his own net worth is not $1.6 billion, we're led to believe. So what they really meant was he put this big bet on that could have made up to $1.6 billion had the perfect scenario occurred, which was a significant drop in the price of the stock market in the quarter that we've just been through. Now, the filings are not down to the level of, we know exactly what duration or put options, as they're called technically, he puts on. So there's a fair bit of speculation that has to be undergone. But the point is, one of the smartest people who made his the first parts of his fortune shorting stocks at the point of the dot-com bubble, and then made big money around 2008 around the subprime mortgage crisis, which obviously is the subject of the great film The Big Short, thinks that the stock market's going to collapse and thinks that in general the US economy is in trouble. He doesn't speak, hardly ever speaks online. So the last interview I could find with him was an interview with Bloomberg in 2019, and most of us will agree the world looks a pretty different place than it did in 2019. But he did do one cryptic tweet in January this year when he tweeted "sell." That's all he tweeted. So he's obviously had a bit of a view on the market over the course of this year, and the intelligent speculation, and I'm inclined to agree with it, suggests that this is to do with the fact that the interest rate is too high and the economy can't cope with this interest rate for any sustained period of time. And I have to sort of go all the way back. I give myself a bit of a beating today, which someone in the Facebook comments had picked me up on. But, you know, I like to try and get it right as much as possible all of the time. Obviously, that's impossible when you're forecasting. The traditional conventional wisdom says when you get it wrong, just pretend that you didn't and move on and start talking about some other stuff. As you know, I generally eschew the conventional wisdom. So I'd rather point out where I got it right and where I got it wrong and what I hadn't stitched together correctly, because otherwise I don't know how I'm supposed to get better at doing it in the future, realistically. So, you know, I was very pleased to get the call right about fixing mortgage debt early, middle of last year. And I've had lots and lots of people, and we're talking, I think I'll probably claim 100 million quid's worth of debt fixed at lower prices, which is a really phenomenal achievement, of course, but that's great. That's already happened. What's next, and how are we gonna deal with it before it gets here, rather than wait till it's happened and go, "Ooh, maybe we should have seen that one coming," you know? So that's why I was relatively hard on myself. And obviously, when one of the great short sellers of all time sees a major problem coming, one of the things I pointed out in today's supplement was one of the things that put pressure on him during or in the lead up to the late 2008 events in the US was the music kept going for a lot longer than anybody would have expected it to, and no one could really understand why it was still going. Now, of course, the big investment banks were offloading their toxic positions by then. They knew to be worthless or nearly worthless, or certainly worth pennies on the pound, to unsuspecting clients who didn't really understand what was going on. And so they could reverse a lot of their books so that it could stay solvent. And even though they did pull every stroke in the book, just about within the framework of the law, of course, although there's lots of debate to be had about whether anybody should have gone to jail during all of that, but they seem to have generally got away with it. They still needed big Warren to bail them out of Goldman's, didn't they? You know, for example, when they needed a significant cash injection, and that's why he tends to keep these days 100 billion plus in the back pocket, because he knows when there is motivation, he's going to strike. And again, Buffett hasn't been particularly vocal. You know, you can go on YouTube, and if you start searching for stock market crash, you know, Jeremy Grantham will pop up relatively quickly, who's been talking about it for the last forever. Although, again, a man who deserves a significant amount of respect because he's made a lot of money out of being bearish at the appropriate times. So it then comes down to how do we try and apply that to the UK property market? And I got involved in an interesting thread about this on one of the groups yesterday, which was regarding buy to let, buy to sell, current state of the market. Upset someone as usual without really trying to, just by calling it as I see it, because someone decided to blame Brexit for the fate of the UK housing market between 2017 and 2019, and the buy to let sector specifically. And in context, as someone who voted Remain, I see absolutely no evidence whatsoever that that's any form of a significant influence on the market during that point. The significant influences were Section 24 started to bite and tax returns were getting filed. And also the PRA issued the new guidelines around mortgage coverage rules for 2-year mortgages. Now that's, you know, I think factually based and directly relevant to the sector, rather than just saying, yeah, we shouldn't have left the EU. Right. Okay, fair enough. You're all entitled to our own opinions. The reality is we did, and therefore all we needed to really do is get on with it. But the rest of the thread was also talking about, you know, a really simple level, throwing the numbers out there as they are within what we're doing. When you're looking at it, I've used the word dichotomous a few times here. You know, we had a massive bump in the value of the property that we already owned when the pandemic came, right? There wasn't any skill. There was being in the right place at the right time, which is always handy. Put yourself in that place. Sure, that's where the skill lies, but enjoy it while the deck hits you in the face, as they'd say if it was a poker game, right? The flip side of that is what we now pay for is the fact that new purchases are much more difficult to make stack up. So if you accept roughly maintenance costs up about 70%, insurance costs up somewhere in the same sort of bracket. I'm talking 2019 to today, really, to be clear when I say this, right? Interest costs on new loans up 100% if you use interest only financing, right? Rents up about 35%, roughly, something like that, maybe a shade more, but you don't need to be a genius. Now, prices were up 25%. You might accept there's maybe been a 5% adjustment on that. So capital value is up 20%. So if you put all those numbers together, it should be self-evident that things don't work in the same way that they used to. And the road this is leading me down is the buy, refurb, refinance model is really, really struggling on that basis. It's really struggling. And a lot of bits of work where you would have said, right, we're going to spend 20k on a refurb, it's becoming 35 using those numbers, 70% increase or whatever. And at 35 or 34, it just doesn't work in the same way because you're not buying the house 10 grand cheaper than you otherwise were, or you're not even buying it at the same price you were in 2019. You're having to potentially pay more. So that's what's leading us to do fewer deals because we're having to kick a lot harder to get things to work. Now, the problem and the point of the thread really was that's all fine in the void. And the reason why I brought up Dr. Burry is because the big lesson from The Big Short is things can go on for a lot longer than you think they would. It's the old John Maynard Keynes, the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. It can go on a lot longer than you think it would, even though things look slightly bleak, or in the case of 2008, really significantly, inevitably bleak, when you had millions and millions in the US, tens of millions of people who couldn't afford to pay their mortgages because they were set up to fail. Let me be clear, today's situation is nothing like that. But what you've got is, even for those of us who were happily in the right place at the right time and fixed our mortgage debt at the end of last year, if it was now the point where that was going to drop off, a lot of these houses that we're holding wouldn't look like they were worthwhile holding at all, right? Or we'd be holding them for £150 a month cash flow when we were making 350, and the 150 we're making is only worth 100 quid in old money thanks to inflation taking such a big bite. So you need 4.5 times as many properties, but you can't buy in order to make the same sort of cash flow. Now, that obviously doesn't affect at least half the market, because at least half the market is unencumbered and is just, and although that doesn't affect them on the interest, it does still affect them on the maintenance and all the rest of it. So it depends on their philosophy to asset managing the portfolio. But one of the big points in the thread was there's lots and lots of people saying, I can't believe it's 200 quid for this or it's 400 quid for this. And I was saying, but the underlying message here is there's no money there for people to use to asset manage their portfolios correctly, because it's all been squeezed out of it. The poor tenants have been pushed to the brink of where the market will allow them to go at the moment. But now, if you use and this is probably the most controversial and incendiary statement, but I will stand behind it because I think it's 100% correct. The idea that 125% of rent can cover is the mortgage cover calculation is fundamentally incorrect, right? I've always been worried about it, but I've always thought, 125, it's about break-even level, right? Maybe losing a bit depending on where you are in the country and how involved you are, how active you are in managing the portfolio. Today, I feel like it's wrong. It's just completely wrong. And it should be closer to where the PRA set the 2-year limit, which is 145%. I think that is sensible. But 5 years might not be enough time to repair some of this damage that's being done by the much higher rates in the market. And my personal view has always been at least 150% for something to be viable to hold. Otherwise, what's the point? And we gunned for 200% coverage in the days where we were fixing mortgages sub 4%.
And I think that also depends on the region, because if you have a rent of £600 a month, even 150 might not be enough, because if your boiler breaks down, that's like a massive cost comparing to the monthly rent, instead of like costs down in London, where for 1 month of rent you can replace a boiler and paint the property.
Yeah, I think it's a good challenge, but I do think there's one thing I'd like to say on that, because that is often raised, and there is obviously a significant element of truth in what you say, but it's just slightly more complex than that, I think, because really there's a fixed cost of running a property and there's a variable cost of running a property. So it costs the same to run a property in London as it does in Stoke. It's not true, right? For a number of reasons. One of them being when you have a tenancy changeover, right? Unless you are doing it yourself, which means you're not doing it on any sort of scale, right? But unless you're doing it yourself, it also means you've got the time or you've got the drive to do it. Because I know a lot of people who earn a lot of money, who work very hard and still manage their own portfolios, which blows my mind, absolutely blows my mind. But fair play to them. That's an incredible work rate that they've got there. Although I don't know what the standard they manage them to is, obviously. If you find a tenant in London, if you're using a hands-off sort of model, you might be paying 15% of the rent up front for a 2-year tenancy. And on the 2-year turnaround, you might find that you need to do significantly more to the property than you do to that £600 a month rental. So I think you have to look at it as there's a fixed cost element to running a tenancy. So when you get into the lower rents, as you correctly say, Piotr, that is going to bite a lot more, because if it costs, let's say, £20 a month for the insurance, if you've got a reasonable policy, and it costs, if you amortize the cost of just the electrical certificate, the EPC, and the gas safe, let's say, right, that might end up being another £25 a month, something like that. If that's 45 quid before you start a month and you've only got 600 rent, there's no maintenance been budgeted for in any of that, right? If, however, that tenancy is likely to last for 8 years, whereas your 2-year tenancy in London is going to last for 2 years and someone's probably going to move on, then you've got 4 times as many tenant fines in the London property. And so that does make a difference. And this has always been about I wanted from the start to let 3-bed semi-detached in good school areas, right? Because I knew that regardless of where you are in the country, the void is absolutely the enemy of the landlord, right? It destroys returns. So years where things turn over, and yeah, boilers are a pain, and roofs can be a big problem. But having compared roofs with London investors before, we found that what we were paying maybe £4,500 for, people were willing to pay 20 grand for, or not necessarily willing, but they had to pay 20 grand for, because of the cost of scaffolding and closing roads, and just the fact that it's just much harder to do that sort of job in relatively central London. So regardless of either way, the percentage increases that I alluded to earlier are still there, and the unspoken reality of what the interest rate is doing, in my opinion, and I'm not really seeing any evidence of this in real time because it's too slow to really hang my hat on it. But I think there'll be a lot of people who are not managing their portfolios in terms of the maintenance side at all, and they're having to put plasters over absolutely everything. And if this situation lasts for 3-4 years, which it easily could with the way that inflation can hang around, you're going to have 3 or 4 more years, more wear and tear on a sector where, on the social, because let's face it, the maintenance costs are working in the same way to the social housing sector as well, right? That already have a percentage of recognised understandard for the sector homes that they have to deal with. Every house gets 1 year older every year. And there's this kind of very long-term thing that we very rarely talk about, that as we dropped the housing targets earlier this year, some bright spark worked out in about 1970 something that we were building a lot of homes back then in the post-war boom, right? Up to 400,000 a year at some point. We were also knocking a lot of stuff down, right? And so when you look at the net number of buildings added, which is not the one that anybody ever focuses on because it's not the one in the headlines and all the rest of it, but the net actually wasn't that impressive compared to the net that we've achieved in some of the years since 2000. But the problem is, how have we achieved that net? Well, we just stopped knocking stuff down. Right now, that's okay, but at some point in the future it has to catch up with you, and that's the wrap concrete point of view. You put the beam in, you say it's going to work for 30 years, Nobody does the checks and balances. No one sets the Google Calendar 30 years in advance to say, better check that beam out, don't you think? And then, of course, of all the many billions of pounds worth of rack that's been used, of course, it's lasted for much longer than anybody expected that it would, but some of them have started to go wrong. And then it opens the book on how big is this ticking time bomb of things waiting to go wrong. So this kind of relatively unique UK problem that we have, where the stock is so old, and on average every year it gets 9 months older, or 11 months older probably. I don't know the number, but because we add so few new units to the pipeline, you know, in terms of the general housing mix, it probably gets 11.75 months older every 12 months. And, you know, at some point in the future, that has to cause a problem, because a lot of even though Victorian builds are pretty good, do we expect them to last more than 250 years? No, I don't think we do. Do we expect them to last more than 100 years? Yeah, I think, you know, time has proven that, generally speaking, they do. So we're potentially 123 years into that sort of cycle, roughly. So at what point in the near future, or in a comparatively near future, does that become a problem? And that's very long-term strategic thinking about the sector, but probably supports why, apart from anything else, when something goes wrong, and regardless of your sort of libertarian or authoritarian viewpoints or political bents, the government has to step in when things like energy performance upgrades are needed. And at this time, imagine trying, if I'm telling you people probably aren't maintaining the houses as well as they should be, imagine loading onto the sector more costs in terms of, and that probably supports the reality around the net zero side of what Sunak did last week, even if people don't like it or not. But that's probably more than enough spewing from me to open it to the floor. I can see Jay's got at least 3 very good things to say, so I'm going to hand over to him.
I've definitely got one good thing to say, or at least it's an observation rather than a good thing to say. I don't know if it's necessarily good, but I think over the last 20 years of looking in the auctions, every time you see something that says by order of XX Housing Association, insert bullshit name, doesn't matter which one, you are guaranteed to find the following things. Guaranteed to find mold. You're guaranteed to find cracking around windows. You're absolutely guaranteed to find a bath suite that's at least 15 years old. You're guaranteed on some instances to find, you know, one of those old style hob cookers that aren't built in, that just kind of standalone thing that looks like it's from the 60s. Guaranteed. When I look at, and this isn't a carte blanche for the industry, but for the property investors that I know that are portfolio landlords, that post some of the pictures about the refurbs that they've done, and the properties that they bought, and the things that they're doing, I would argue that on the whole, responsible private landlords are doing an exceptional job of maintaining and putting good housing stock out there, as opposed to the, could you call them corporates? Call them corporates, as opposed to the corporates. And indeed, even when you count in that the, you know, council housing, and don't get me wrong, council housing, you know, in the 70s and 80s was built exceptionally very well. I think people forget that. You know, minimum size standards be damned. You buy an ex-council, it's going to be above the next 5 minimum size standard increases you're going to find. I grew up in council housing, and I think for twice over 15 years, they came in and they redid the kitchen, they redid the 2 bathrooms. They didn't paint or do anything like that, but they made sure that things like that were done. Don't get me wrong, the work wasn't necessarily the best. It was, you know, they were doing 150 houses on that set. You know, it was kind of like a, you know, it's like Lego building. They were just putting the same set together and banging it in, whether it fit the room or not. It was just going to happen. And I don't see quite as much of that now. I'm probably fortunate insofar as I probably don't know any scummy landlords that do half-assed jobs and put people into hovels. I probably don't know those people. I don't want to know those people. But I do know that for the most part, that some of the larger housing institutions provide far less in terms of a standard of living and a quality of home than you find elsewhere. So
Can I just add one thing to that, Jay, which is, this is a typical tragedy of the common style situation. Doesn't that tell you where the future of the sector will be, thanks to the George Osborne train that started in 2015? Because it's pushing out all of these smaller landlords for sort of interest rate reasons and tax reasons and things like that. But what happens to those properties? Well, they either go into the owner-occupier market, which is great, or they get bought up by a company that is going to be bought up by a bigger company that's going to be bought up by a bigger company, which is exactly what's happened with the housing associations as Pac-Man comes along, like he always does, in the oligopolistic sort of sector, and you end up with 6 or 4 or 3 monstrous players at the top who, with 240,000 houses, that they're never going to maintain those sort of standards. And they've got accountants, and even the HAs, who, bear in mind, were raising funds at 0.5% yield on their bonds in 2021, right? Today, that 0.5 is 4.5. So does that make their business and their cash flow better or worse? And of course, I mean, they have had the luxury of an element of a rise depending on which social housing services they provide. But if they relied on LHA, they've had nothing since the 1st of April 2020, which was their first rise since the 1st of April 2014. So the maths can't add up to, and that's why you wouldn't get those 2 new kitchens in 15 years or whatever. It just wouldn't happen these days, because since austerity, the red pen gets put in there, and people just can't. The local authority gets told, well, you can't afford that money, or the HA, the board at the HA says, we haven't got those funds to deploy, so we can't deploy them. So you end up with this kind of, here's the rules. Well, the rules don't fit the budget and everything else. But the problem is, of course, at the other end of that, the chief exec and the C-level execs are on, several £100,000 a year, and are absolutely creaming it when people are living in damp and mouldy and all the rest of it conditions. Whereas I think in the private sector, there's a very small amount of realization. It's a little bit like, it's been a really interesting thing to watch the Labour private schools debate thing that's been going on, because some hardcore lefty came out and said, right, this is the first thing that we're going to do, whatever. And then Starmer thought, 7% of people with kids send them to private schools, right? So if you put that argument in the same box as the ULEZ argument, who, let's face it, Uxbridge had Boris as their MP, they'd taken it right in the face in a whole number of ways in terms of the most recent governmental changes, but still they were so angry about ULEZ that they still voted against Labour and for Conservative in the by-election. It was close, right? But we're talking a party that's polling approval ratings at the time of like -28, -30, still winning a by-election. It's nearly unheard of. And that's because ULEZ Tories were clever. ULEZ became a single issue campaign for them in that particular by-election. I think there was a chance that the whole private school thing could do the same, because you're going to alienate 7% of parents, the ones who do send their kids to private school. And you might say, look, they're not Tory voters, but I can tell you quite openly that certainly of the independent schools that I know in this area, the vast majority of the parents are not the super rich, are not mega wealthy. That probably represents about 10% of the parent base at the school. The other 90%, a number of them work at the school so they can get a fee discount. They're older parents who've got one child and have decided to make that investment because they've got the spare cash flow, and or they make really significant sacrifices to send their kids to private school. Now, that's not the people necessarily that you'd want to be punishing, but not only those people, you've also got all the people behind them who are what you would call aspirational private school parents who think, I'm nearly there, or I might be there if I get that next big promotion or whatever. And if I get there, then someone's going to try and tax me 3 times over because I'm already paying into the state system, just like I do if I've got private healthcare, right? And I'm already paying significant fees. Not that these schools are making incredible amounts of money, but they are well looked after from an endowment point of view. But of course, the governors, the trustees, and the bursar would tell you they're just doing their job like any responsible organisation. In the same way that a mutually run building society needs to keep savings on its balance sheet so it doesn't get wiped out by, for example, a 515 basis point increase in the base rate, let's say, which makes a significant disruption to the lending and savings markets, right? So you're it's the politics of envy side of it that worries me, and that's why I think Starmer came straight out and stamped on it and said, no, that's not the route we're going with this stuff, because they've got to prove a couple of things. One, Labour have always got to prove, rightly or wrongly, that they're going to be fiscally responsible, because it's the lowest hanging fruit to say, oh, you can't trust them with anything, they'll just spend all the money, sort of thing. They left that note in the Treasury saying, good luck, there's no money left, or whatever, right? That's the first thing that gets wheeled out. But they've also got to prove that they're not going to be effectively a more authoritarian regime where the government's going to tell you what to do more and more and more of the time. And this is why they've got a really difficult task, because when you layer on top of that, this is the highest taxing Conservative government post-war, right? Tax hasn't got so much further that it can go without completely killing economic growth and incentive to crack on with things. So it does make it much more tempting at the moment. I can certainly look from my own personal position. It's more tempting under the current tax regime to sell assets and take money out of companies than it is to try and grow companies, because you're looking into the void of uncertainty, thinking, well, am I going to need to pay 60%, 70% to get this money out? In which case, who am I working for, and why am I doing it? And why am I taking the risk, and why am I putting the effort in? What I could do is just say, well, do you know what? That's been a jolly nice run. I'll plateau, or I'll even downsize a little bit and take some money out of it and enjoy it, before it gets so bad that you can't. And that's the classic sort of tax. This tax is complicated because you've got people who fundamentally disagree with paying any. You've got a kind of fair rate that people, I think, see at around 20%, 25% seems to be nothing that upsets people too much, apart from the people who don't want to pay any. But then when you get into the sort of 42, 47, 50, 70% marginal tax rate if you lose your personal allowance, you start thinking, but there must be a lot of people every year who think, they get a really nice pay rise from 108k to 123k, let's say. And when they think they must feel really, really good about that promotion that they've just had. And when they look at their pay slip at the moment, they'll be getting less than, they'll be getting a few £100 a month out of that, realistically. All they'll do probably is up their pension contribution, because they think, well, what the bloody hell else can I do? What else can I do with that? Because I'm not seeing any of it. And once your mortgage is up, if you earn that sort of money, your mortgage hasn't gone up £250 a month. It's gone up £750 a month. If your timing wasn't necessarily right around all of that, your pay rise isn't going to pay for that, because the rest of it's all going into the government coffers. So it's a challenging situation. But the route that things are going towards, we will go back to more of the. I mean, people moan about it because they cherry pick their point at 1983 or whatever, when things were all going reasonably well and right to buy hadn't really decimated the amount of publicly owned stock that there still was, and we hadn't had to deal with the fact we got no replacement strategy. But you go back to 1900 and 90% of the population rented, and how many landowners and landlords do you think there were then? Very, 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 very few. Almost all of whom had been arbitrarily allocated by birthright, apart from anything else. There wasn't, even the Grosvenor estate really got its big stroke of luck when one of the great grandparents married into the family that owned Belgravia back when it was marshes, wasn't it? That's where a lot of it all came from. But that's that's a tiny part of the sector, which has generally been built on building blockers of very entrepreneurial people who've made sacrifices to try and get into it, and now are facing business models that are like, well, in terms of new units going forward, volume's decimated. So unless you're unencumbered and still growing your portfolio, which is a strange. I mean, there will be funds out there that are doing that, of course, because they're trying to allocate capital. And they're trying to build something that they're maybe looking to IPO in the future, for example. But unless you're, and also on the social side, because there's so much need and so much demand, and it's underwritten by the government, of course, as well. So that all makes sense, generally speaking. But if you're unencumbered due to age and all the rest of it, what's the incentive for pressing on buying more stuff these days. You know, it's as low as it's been for 10 or 15 years, and it gets to the stage where supply and demand is almost not even a debate anymore, because we'd need so much more supply and or so much less demand. But I did notice this week, interestingly, on that front, because of the recent, I think it's mostly because of the small boat stuff, apart from anything else, immigration has just reared its head to third most important issue in the polls behind cost of living and healthcare. So it was languishing about sixth the last time I checked, which is probably about 6 months ago. But it's now back up to third. And again, that might be an election battleground. And I can't wait to hear what wonderful things Suella Braverman's going to have to say to go to the right of where she already is, because it will be quite a marvel. But yeah, should be interesting. But no one said any numbers for the year yet, of course, because we're not there yet. But the numbers that were coming out at the beginning of this year were more like 750,000 net migrants, which is just mind-blowing when you think we're going to build 111,000 new units. Scary stuff for the future, realistically. Rant over. Soapbox over.
I was going to say something horrendous, but it's a little too dystopian, I think.
Well, it's funny. I was talking to a friend of mine this week, and we very much both share this sort of dystopian reality of within, and it always takes longer than you think, these things, but within maybe 10 or 15 years, there's going to be significant sway. There's only two ways things can go. Either Jeremy Corbyn style, but to the left of Corbyn, full Karl Marx land grab, all property is theft, so we're thieving it off you, which I see as extremely unlikely, to be clear, because that would be very interesting for all private property owners in the country, aka about 66% of the voting base, apart from anything else. Or the council or central government or some kind of organisation needs to lease back properties on a significant level in order to save money, because the business models that are there in social these days, if you took someone like Civitas, for example, the way they justify their existence is they say, look, we get people out of hospital beds and into appropriate accommodation with support, right? Hospital bed costs, can't remember what it is, I think it's possibly over £3,000 a week, I think, to keep someone in a hospital bed. And Civitas's point is they can deliver that. They can stop the bed blocking for £1,500 a week, or similar sort of level of cost. So they can halve the cost. So it becomes a bit of a no-brainer. Although the problem that's sitting within all the local authorities is, and this is from friends of mine who deal with temporary accommodation quite a lot, the contracts tend to be 12 months long, because then they don't have to be amortized on what already looks like a horrific balance sheet that, in honesty, under any scrutiny, is effectively bankrupt, right? But the problem is that, obviously, it's easy for me to say, well, they're 12 months long, but the problem's not going away. But if you're going to try and persuade someone to make a £50 million equity investment or £100 million equity investment into a sector, they don't want to hear, well, the problem's not going away, is it? They want to see a 5-year or ideally a 50-year agreement in which they can say, right, okay, so we understand there's capex at the front end, and then there's an income stream over the next 40 or 50 years. But a lot of the councils can't sign these sort of agreements because the accounting side of it doesn't stack up. The only way that can be fixed, the only way you're ever going to fix that is by central government stepping in and underwriting it. It's the only way.
Interesting.
Can you do more dystopian than that? I'm sure you can.
I was going to say, look, if the taxes get any worse, and the left gets in, they'll just nationalise everything. Everyone will be put on some basic standard of living with food vouchers and clothing vouchers, and then no one has to worry about there being the rich and the poor, because everything will be a flat line. And that's probably as dystopian as I was going to get.
The thing is, Jay, I think the worrying thing is quite a few people think that would be a reasonably good idea. That's the worrying thing. That
is the scary part. That actually sounds like bliss to some people. I mean, you think there's a terrible suicide rate now in today's society. Watch that quadruple fairly bloody quickly when you take out any hope of being able to achieve anything greater for yourself, for your family, for your local community, whatever, it all goes.
Yeah.
Then you start looking at things going backwards, right? People then start looking at convenience as being something that's negative. So then they start taking away things that have propelled us further into the future than we were 20 or 30 years ago. So you start seeing technology and science start to unravel. And then you see the same thing happening within society. And then everything is easily controlled, because in order to enact most of these things, you have to put a Caesar-style authoritarian arse wanker in control. And there's no way to undo that. There never has been. It took the Italians 400 years to reverse, Caesar Emptor. So yeah. Dystopian enough, or do you want a little more?
I think arse wanker is certainly lively for a Sunday morning. Yeah, indeed. I think it's pretty dystopian, but I think there are organisations out there that are pushing the hard left agenda quite significantly, who often refer to places like Venezuela as an example. This is a Corbyn line of attack, wasn't it? Big supporter of Venezuela, and just look at what the hell goes on in Venezuela and how people look at the life expectancy, look at the standard of living, look at what ends up happening is, and unfortunately, it's that people get embroiled within capitalism, Marxism, everything in between on the two spectrums. Socialism has a hugely broad. You go to most of the US, they think the NHS is a rabid socialist system in certain parts, for example, but the outcomes are so much better for so much less money than so many of the population. I think I know where 80-90% of the UK would stand on that, and the 10-20% who don't like it is because they feel they pay too much tax and they don't get enough benefit from it. Although when they get to 89 years old, which they inevitably do because the rich always live longer, they'll probably be pretty glad they've got the NHS on their doorstep or whatever. So but it's not really and truly a left and right political thing. What it really and truly is that human nature can be bad, checks and balances are needed, and regardless of the rules of the game that you put in place, there'll always be people who try and beat those rules and get around those rules. And if you give it massive power to a centrally commanded body, then you risk a North Korea or a Venezuela or whatever style situation. And this is why that I love that phrase, it's said both about capitalism and democracy. It's the worst system apart from all the others.
Yeah.
And it's very deliberate because no one's saying it's great. It's the lesser of what it is it's a lesser of evils. And of course, what you have to do, and going back to housing, what we absolutely don't do is have appropriate legislation that then gets enforced. Instead, we have hundreds and hundreds of pieces of legislation that are quite confusing because it's there in case the council decide, or one particular environmental health officer is having a bad day or whatever and decides to pick on you when across the street there's much worse going on. And that's a shame because, again, that would need significant regulation with teeth. But, things like damp and mold can be largely eliminated. The problem with eliminating them is we're talking insulation, first of all, which, the government's been on that bus, be fair to them, for 20 plus years. They've known about the problem. The problem is just how early we industrialize compared to everybody else. So we have a unique problem in that age of housing stock, as we've already talked about today, right? The other thing you can look at is ventilation, retrofitting things like these new air systems or whatever, positive input ventilation that move air around the house and stop mold and things like that. The other situation is to make sure people who live in the house take responsibility for not drying their clothes on radiators, making sure a tumble dryer is vented if they're using a tumble dryer, making sure fresh air gets into the house even when it's cold. And it's easy to say but people are generally poorly educated around how to keep a house at the right temperature and, what to do and what not to do at certain times of the year. Although you could argue global warming is actually benefiting that side of things from, which is probably the second most controversial statement of the day behind just some of Jay's dystopian chat. But, another mild winter wouldn't do us any harm in terms of energy bills and the poorest 20% in society, that's for sure.
Well, the good news is there's global warming, so hopefully it won't be as aggressive as it has been in recent years, the harsh winters. So every cloud has a silver lining. So I had a thought the other day, and it wasn't quite an intrusive thought, but I was sitting there thinking, there's quite a lot of people that are quite shocked at how the government acts at times. It's giving their friends contracts and doing all these things. The people are shocked by this, and I was sitting there thinking, I was like, people weren't paying attention to this government when we were in the EU. The EU do that a lot more than the UK can do that, right? And then I was thinking, well, why weren't people talking about governments being corrupt and doing all these different kind of things before? So I was sitting there thinking, well, actually, maybe it was because there was a couple of wars. Actually, kind of national focus tends to be on lives lost and bad people put down, rather than someone gave a cleaning job for the windows at Parliament to his next door neighbour Dave, who's been a window cleaner for 30 minutes. And then I realised actually it's probably just because of the communication. Now you go back 40 years, there wasn't the same level of communication there is today. Okay, you've got the BBC and blah blah blah. And you can trust that as far as you can, right? But anyone else, right? You can take a news statements throughout all over the world. But then you go back 80 years and you realize actually, you would have had to have had a friend in a place that would have written to you and told you of a certain situation that was taking place. Then you'd have to take that information and try and spread it around, which was almost impossible 80, 90 years ago. So I kind of think, governments and parliaments have always been like this. And it's now only easier to see because you're able to focus on it. It's not even about checks and balances, especially with this government. It doesn't matter about checks and balances. They're just way too overt with it. But actually, it's because if you're not hearing it from state-sanctioned media, you'll be hearing it from other media outlets, other independent thinkers, people with platforms, people with voices. And I think that's something that's really very interesting.
I think it's incredibly interesting because I think it leads to two things that happen, one really positive and one really negative. And the really positive is that there are multiple places and sources to draw the data from. And whereas you look at, even in the Cameron government, for example, Rupert Murdoch would have still had really, really significant influence. And that influence has waned away really significantly over the past decade or so, right? I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a really good thing. The problem is, on the other side of that, is that although for those who don't like them, Ofcom are often called, off communists or whatever, they do exist to protect people as a regulator. And for those who find it difficult to distinguish between complete and utter doo-doo and something that resembles the truth or an opinion, if you buy from the person who sells best rather than the person who's got the best product, there's potential to get into quite a lot of trouble. So that's where you get whipped up into some of these, you could throw a few names around, couldn't you? But Russell Brand would be one who would divide people quite significantly. Is Russell's version of the truth something anybody should be trusting? Well, by reckoning, there's about 6.5 million people who are quite significantly with him, who are not necessarily from this country. But on the one side, it's that I can't remember who said the quote, but even though I think you're a bloody idiot, I'll defend your right to speak to the deaf, because free speech is important. But on the other side, how do the more naive, how do those who are, because you could get back to property education here quite easily, couldn't you? Do you know what I mean? Should it be the people who have the puffery? Should it be the people who have the sharpest suits or the least Lamborghinis or whatever that are making the biggest splashes, and also are, whether you like it or not, to an extent, to a lot of the outside world, they represent the property investment community, right? Which is annoying, right? For those of us who are in the Helen looks more than annoyed. She looks distraught, I think it's fair to say. But yeah, it's extremely upsetting sometimes. But that's the nature of the beast. You could say, well, cheer up and get a bigger marketing budget and get better at selling stuff. I don't know.
It is sad though, because exactly like you say, that's a lot of people think of and quote. But are they investors? Yes, they're investors, but more than that, basically what you said, they're marketeers. And to be honest, you know, there's some of those people that I think about, and I don't know. I've never been to any of their stock, but like Jay said, like we don't know many people personally that would let their stock get into, you know, kind of disrepair and let people live in. But do you know what? I know if there was somebody, I know would be right at the top of that list, and it's one of those marketeers who I won't name today, but.
We've got a couple of comments in our chat, and just bring them up on screen just to make sure they're acknowledged. From Graham, number of local authorities removing previously installed cavity walls insulation from the housing stock and replacing the modern equivalent polystyrene beads.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because that's a pretty typical example of some of the stuff I've talked about in energy performance before, where you sort of you crack on with the solution before the necessary amount of testing and research has been done, and you could level that against certain solar and wind installations, which in 25 years won't look very, very good at all in terms of the money in versus what's been generated. Kind of going green at all costs, which is obviously what Sunak's tried to stamp out. And but of course, sometimes you've got to implement stuff and hope that it works. I mean, I remember years ago, everyone was saying, well, cavity wall's terrible and it can do this and it can do that and it can do the other. And a lot of it was relatively false dawn stuff. But then again, spray foam insulation in the rafters in the roof, when it was relatively quickly sent to market, has caused a lot of people a lot of problems and made their properties unmortgageable and destroyed significant value.
Yeah, brilliant. We've got a few comments from Rupert about media and how easy it is to make people accountable but also exposed to defamation.
Yeah, we talked about that a bit last week, didn't we? And it's very difficult to know what to do, really.
Yeah, and then the AI kind of impact on things.
Yes.
So, brilliant. Well, I think this has been a super entertaining conversation off the back of this big short thing, and I'm pretty sure we'll be monitoring the S&P situation very closely now. It makes it much more interesting when there's something like that going on.
It's hit a 3-month low this week, interestingly enough. So, yeah, perhaps he knows what he's talking about, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Well, if he doesn't get the timing right, that's the kind of opportunity for everyone else to get in, because maybe the timing will be right after his thing.
Yeah.
So, anyway, brilliant conversation. Thank you everyone for listening on all the different channels that we are on, and we will see you all next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.